Okay, so last time I was talking about agriculture and sort of this perceptual thing. I want to go on a little more, and I'm going to give you a Hawaii example for how some of this plays out, especially this decisions which you might call commercial agriculture. Because in some ways we're actually the classic example of this in some aspects of this. The huge dominance on sugar and pineapple, for example, into the 1950s, massive change in the landscape in that period. All this moved from basically a subsistence system to nothing but commercial ag. And to a certain extent, if you think of someplace like Waikiki, which I think I might have mentioned last time, which you've got as an area that originally was subsistence, wet field agriculture, both originally Hawaiian and then later Chinese for the purpose of growing food for people here to eat, and also raising chickens and ducks. And then all of a sudden, wham, and because you can make a hell of a lot more money out of it, you bulldoze the whole place, you cover over in concrete, and you turn it into Waikiki. And then you bring in an artificial beach, and you make Waikiki Beach. That's probably one of the most striking examples of the commercialization or commodification of a landscape. That you basically get rid of one of the richest agricultural zones in this part of the island because you've decided that recreation / tourism is much more valuable use of the land than agriculture. But one of the side effects is all of a sudden tomorrow everyone decided we need to be able to feed ourselves. You could not bulldoze Waikiki and turn it back into functional agricultural land. It would be almost impossible. You've completely destroyed that land as an agricultural potential by the time you put concrete and asphalt and everything else on it. So, Hawaii in many cases could almost be like the poster child or parable story for the changes and the choices you make and how much the sort of a one-way street in this process. But the first thing I want to do is I want to go switch over here. So what I want to look at is sort of this plantation and ranching, but also the shift from subsistence to commercial agriculture. And we're going to be using the Hawaii example, one, because I use it in a bunch of other classes. Two, it's actually, at least in my view, it's one of the most visible and striking examples of this process. So here you see the Big Island. This is the Kona or windward side of the Big Island. This is Kohala up here, and we're going down into North Kona down here. If you're all familiar with the Big Island, here's Waimea Town, and you're going down to the coast with Kauai High and Waikoloa, Pu'akoa, and then down over here to Kailua Kona. So this whole area here, if you ever drive through this area, it's pretty seriously dry. Let's see what that picture got over here. This is the Big Island in 2020. Now, when you look at this landscape, there's a tendency when we see it today, and of course you go further down this way and it's actually lava, but there's a tendency to see this as the landscape is the way it has been. It isn't. This landscape is entirely artificial and something that occurred. It was artificial but intentional that it starts to happen in the early 19th century and becomes sort of fixed by the 1830s, 1840s. What happens is this whole area was actually in field systems. If I do this right, I can usually find this. Hey, cut that out. Go Malka here, right about. Oh, here we go. Okay, if you guys look carefully at what you're seeing here in the Google Earth image, you see a whole mess of little lines. I'm going this way. So you see all these lines row after row. Now the hillside's going down this way. So these lines are at right angles to the hillside. And if you notice, there's just tons of them. Now it says something really sad in many ways, that when archaeologists started to look in the 1950s and looked at these lines, and if you notice, they just go all the way up. Here's a house site, here's a 19th century corral. Here's another house site here, but all the rest of these are these lines. They're not very, very fancy. They're not really even walls. They're just basically all the, if you look at them carefully, you realize that all the stones that were in here were thrown into these rows. And from the 1870s or 1880s on, right into the basically early 1970s, no one really paid any attention to these. This whole area is in pasture land, so this is all ranches now. And no one paid any attention to what these lines were. If you're a rancher, they're not relevant. And so in that context, no one really noticed until the archaeologists started to look at it. And they suddenly realized that when you look at this area down slope here, there's actually a lot of villages and a lot of people were living here. And if you go back to the early Western accounts, there were a ton of people living here. This whole area was one of the more populated areas in the Hawaiian Islands at the time of European contact. For example, for Kamehameha and his dad, Kalaniʻaupuu, this was a major source for the warriors and the people that made up their controlling power in the western part of the island, Big Island. And if you look at it now, you know, you're out of luck. There ain't no one going to be able to live there. It's totally dry. It's pretty brutal. And, you know, other than the fact that you got a lot of goats running around here, even the cattle can't pretty much survive down here. It's too dry. And yet the weird thing is, if you look at the Western accounts, they talk about this whole area being basically in farms. There was a lot of food there, and there was a ton of people. And you sort of look at it and we'll go, how the hell did you get from what they saw, since they obviously weren't making this stuff up, to what you see here, which is pretty much a big pile of nothing. In other words, like that image we saw, it's just really dry with occasional grasses. And the irony is when archaeologists started looking at that, they realized they actually had the answer in all those little sort of spidery looking walls that you see all the way through this area. If you notice, this isn't the same spot I was before, it's another spot. With the access of largely first aerial pictures, but then especially when Google shows up, they realized that basically you have walls that go all the way from, your walls go all the way from up here, and they go all the way for 27 miles down to here. There's a whole nother set of walls that start up on the other side and go all the way down to South Point pretty much. And so what you've got is walls that go for a subtotal of probably about 48 miles up and down the whole west coast of the Big Island. And they go from anywhere's about 1,000-foot elevation, in other words, where Waimea Town is, all the way down near the coast. And when they actually realized how many of these things they had miles and miles and miles of these things. And on top of that, not only did you have the miles and miles and miles of it, but you have all the Western accounts that are very clear there were a ton of people living there. And yet, if you look now, you can see here, this is typical of the population in this area. They're squat. There's one person for every God knows how many square kilometers of space. It's really seriously empty. And so what they were trying to figure out is, well, how did you get from this that you had that the Europeans saw in, say, the 1780s? And how did you end up with what you've got now, which is pretty much it? And they realized that somehow those walls had a lot to do with that. And what they realized, it was sort of hard to see in this area because the cattle have pretty much whacked this area real severely. But if you actually go down there, you can actually see pieces of walls. There's some right here. I'm still embedded in that landscape. And so what they realized is when they were looking at this, is they were actually looking at something that people were complaining about at this time. When you look at the accounts from the early 19th century, Hawaiians were already starting to complain about the fact that the grazing animals, these were cattle, sheep, and goats, they're brought in the late 1700s by Captain Vancouver, one of the British early, sort of navigators, who was friends with Kamehameha. Vancouver had originally been a lieutenant on Captain Cook's first exploratory voyage that, quote, discovered the Hawaiian Islands. When Cook lands in Kealakekua, a lot of the sailors and officers on his ships got to know some of the Hawaiian chiefs. And one of the Hawaiian chiefs who spent a lot of time with Kamehameha specifically was a young guy at about 20 years of age whose name was Charles Vancouver, who was one of the lieutenants it was his first voyage, and he was on Cook's ship. He and Kamehameha got along really well. And you have to remember, most of the British officers at that time, as were their French counterparts, spoke Tahitian. They didn't speak it particularly well, but they'd spent time in Tahiti. So when they got up to Hawaii, they could actually speak some Hawaiian. Tahitian and Hawaiian, I was trained in Niihau and Kahiki Nui type Hawaiian, which actually sounds a lot like Tahitian versus what I call the sort of UH school Hawaiian. So for me, if I hear Tahitian, I have to think in Hawaiian, but if I hear Tahitian, I can usually puzzle part of it out. It's like a real different dialect. It'd be like French and Italian, but you can actually figure out what's going on. You're not completely lost. It's not like French and Chinese. So in that context, what happened is when the Europeans come up here, they're able to interact with the Hawaiians, and the Hawaiians were, sharp enough and sophisticated enough that when they saw these guys speaking Tahitian, they could also figure out what it was they were trying to say. So you have to remember that when the European explorers are coming up here and interacting with the Hawaiians, it wasn't a grunt and point, draw pictures on your hand or on the sand type thing. They actually could, in a minimal way, sort of communicate with each other. In that context, Cook expedition ends sort of brutally over here. Cook gets whacked in Kealakekua. He runs afoul of Kamehameha's dad, Kalaniʻaupuu, and gets killed. The expedition leaves. on about, I don't know, 8, 10 years, something like that, Vancouver, in charge of a new expedition, comes back to Hawaii. Not surprisingly, he comes back to the same place he'd been before. In that period in between, Kamehameha is now in charge of that whole western part of the Big Island. So the guy he knew as a teenager, 20-year-old, is now in his late 20s, early 30s, and he's now the guy. He's the Iaimoku of that whole part of the island of Hawaii. And Vancouver, ironically, is also promoted. Now he's head of an expedition versus being like a junior officer on a British naval vessel. So they immediately hit it off again. They were already apparently friends. They become really fast friends, spend an enormous amount of time. They're only there for about, I think, a couple of weeks. They spend an enormous amount of time talking with each other. And one of the things that becomes obviously as a source of discussion, again, remember they can actually talk, they're not having to grunt, is that Kamehameha is trying to find out from Vancouver how in British or European societies, governments stay in charge. And Vancouver points out that what you have to have is you have to have revenue streams. You have to have things that you can sell, that you can make money. And with that money, you then buy stuff you want. Because what Kamehameha already wanted was European guns. He wanted European guns, European cannon, European things, so he could conquer the other chiefs and take over the rest of the islands. So he was very explicit, he knew exactly what he wanted. Cam was never slow off the mark. And Vancouver, for whatever set of reasons, helps him as much as he can. I suspect from a technical standpoint, it was probably useful for the British to have someone who was a buddy who was running the islands. So it made sense. Both parties had a reason for what they did. Vancouver, when he leaves the islands, when he leaves Hawaii, he leaves with Kamehameha and his chiefs a small, I think, 4 or 5 cattle, some sheep and some goats that he had on the ship, with very explicit instructions on how you keep these things alive, how you get them to reproduce so you can make a lot more of them, and then how you would make money off of them by basically taking the meat and curing it, putting it in salt so you can sell it to the European ships that are going to go up. And what you'll do is you'll trade them the meat and they'll give you guns. So Vancouver coaches him in how to do this, but Kamehameha as the high chief is the one that makes this happen. So what he does is this whole area was basically solid people. He intentionally lets the sheep, goats, and everything else run free. Oops, can't find it right now. In this area. And all this area was planted in crops, but it was all in those walls that I showed you before. So you should just do it this way again. Now, what Kamehameha needs, and this is rather short-sighted on his side, but I guess, maybe I had no other reason to think about it, is what he really needed was, in his view, is he needed weapons. He needed things, and the way he was going to get those was by, generating revenue. And he did that by making lots of sheep, goats, and cattle, having the meat harvested, and then selling the meat and getting things that go bang out of it. Now, at some point, what he didn't think through is the fact that all of this, if this is all a farm, what's the problem if suddenly goats show up? As someone who hates goats, we still shoot goats on the ranch every chance we get. We don't bother harvesting, we just shoot them. So sorry if you love goats, but I'm an anti-goat person. What's the problem with having 10 semi-cute little goats running around here? And we'll say that this is all Kayla's farm. The whole area is planted in bananas, sweet potatoes, the whole 9 yards. It's just a beautiful, nice, big farm. What don't you see here if you got goats? Well, no, so all of a sudden, for some reason, sorry, I'm going to always pick on him. I'm going to blame Madison on this. All of a sudden, Madison brings the goats in. She's the chief for this area. So Madison brings in goats and says, okay, we're going to run the goats here. Why is Kayla going to be going, wait, time out. What doesn't she have here that she needs if she's got to deal with goats?
A gate?
Yeah, she doesn't have a fence. And you don't have fencing. You don't have a gate. You don't have a fence. You don't got squat. Which means the minute the goats come up here, they go, this is like party central. It's like they've suddenly showed up at a party. There's free food, there's free beer, there's free entertainment, and all they got to do is get their ass on the property, and boom, they're in it. And they just start eating her fields from one end to the other. And all of a sudden, you got a bunch of really fat, happy goats, and she's got no food left. Because on top of that, when Madison set this up, Kayla can't touch the goats because the goats belong to Kamehameha. They're the chief's goats. because he needs the goats so that he can butcher them and sell the meat for money, which he then turns into guns. In that process, he's totally disinterested in the fact that Kayla and all her relatives now suddenly don't have any food to eat. So you got a lot of fat goats, you got a lot of skinny people. Okay. But the high chiefs, especially on the Big Island, Kamehameha most particularly, since this was all his property, really didn't care, because their critical need that they saw was they had gotten into the commercial agriculture business, though they didn't think of it that way. But they were, because they were converting stuff on the land to cash, which in this case they immediately then converted to things like guns. What had happened is Kayla and her relatives are all living in a subsistence system. Now, she has pigs running around the property. Everyone in Hawaii had pigs, but like in the rest of the Pacific, pigs aren't like the pigs you see today. Pigs are domesticated. So they're more like your ideas of a dog. Pigs belong to families. Pigs followed people around. You didn't need pens for pigs, because pigs knew where they were. They were part of the family and they knew where to be. So in that situation, pigs weren't causing her any trouble. But the goats and the sheep and the cattle are a nightmare, because when they come in, they eat everything. And all of a sudden, her bananas, her sugar cane, her sweet potatoes, everything this whole area has been stripped. And at that point, two things happen. The most obvious happen is all of a sudden her and her relatives have no food. And all of a sudden you've got this huge area that's very productive, and there's no food here. So now they're starving. So they're gonna have to leave and go somewhere else and hope they can find food. Secondly, and more striking, this is where it's such a classic environmental parable, is when all this was covered in fields, and when you had these sugarcane and stuff like that, you also had clumps of trees, and especially larger clumps back up in here. What we now know, because we hear accounts from the Hawaiians about that, is this area used to get about twice as much rain as it does now. And the actual land temperature, in other words, if you put a thermometer on the land surface, would be about 6 or 7 degrees cooler than it is now in 2020. The fact that this was all held in very complex land systems and was all covered in green growth meant that basically your cloud and rain cover went all the way down to about here, all the way down to where the highway is. When the goats, the sheep, and the cattle came in and ate all of that vegetation, the rain moved back up here. And all of a sudden by 1810, what you find is all the people living in here who are still trying to survive are now saying, we've had 6 or 8 years of drought and there's no rain falling here anymore. The rain only falls back up here. And you can still see it today. You can see where the green line stops. That green line was all the way down here until 1810. So several things happened simultaneously. One is the need for the animals made a bunch of commercially based decisions that were antithetical to a bunch of things, not the least of which is also your population just literally disappears almost overnight for this whole chunk of the Big Island. The Big Island in 1780 was the most populated island in the Hawaiian Islands, probably had at least maybe 80,000, 100,000 people just on this side of the island, which if you think it is actually more than the entire population of the Big Island by a big chunk. So you had more people living in this area in 1780 than you do of all of Hilo and the whole Puna side of the island in 2020. And it was all based on food they were growing. So it was all subsistence-based agriculture. That entirely disappears when you bring in these grazing animals, which Hawaiians had no experience with. And on top of that, you have kapus from the chiefs that you can't touch or chase the animals. For example, if one of Kayla's brothers decides to go chase the cattle out of the pasture by throwing rocks at him, and the chief sees him, the chief will execute him on the spot. So you kill people for harassing the animals. You're not allowed to put up a fence or a gate, because in doing so, you're going to restrict how much the animals can eat, and that's what the chiefs are concerned about. They want fat animals to make money off of. They're not concerned about what you've got in terms of food. It was one of the huge changes in Hawaiian society in the early monarchy period, was this disinterest, if you would, in the population that makes up the Hawaiian population by the chiefs, not by outsiders. So what it also means is when this is all done, you end up with a system where basically the only thing left is the cattle, the goats, and the sheep. Now the irony is once the cattle and the goat and the sheep eat all this area dry, especially for the cattle, there's now not enough water or green stuff here for them to survive. So once they've destroyed this area in terms of human ability to use it for subsistence, they actually destroy it for their own utility. And if you go in this area, for example, I'm more familiar with East Maui, but for example, this section I'm showing right here on the Big Island, if this were East Maui, if this were Kahiki Nui, this area would have probably about 2,000 goats in it right now. And that's pretty much it. Nothing else lives there. And that's all that can survive in this environment. But if you notice, the environment now is pretty much completely nuked out. You've got little clumps of grasses, occasional kiawe trees, all of which are exotic, so all imported from somewhere else. There's no part of this environment that a Hawaiian from 1780 would recognize. They would think they're in some other part of planet Earth. And of course, the classic example of all this of the problems of the idea of commercialization and cash cropping, of course, be Kaho'olawe. This had a small Hawaiian population that lived here part-time. They actually lived most of their lives in Makena, Wailea side in Maui. They'd come over here and fish. There were houses built and stuff like this. And Kaho'olawe was superb fishing grounds. And so they would live over here occasionally, but there's not a lot of fresh water. There's only 2 springs and they're not very good. So people didn't live here full-time, but it had a dry forest and it had a, vegetation system, and people would plant sweet potatoes, et cetera, et cetera. In the 1870s, it's, pretty much, it's used for a prison for a few years, and that doesn't work. And then it's pretty much just sort of abandoned. It's just sort of sitting there. People used it, but no one thought about it. A family leases it as a ranch in the 1870s, 1880s, and they bring sheep and goats over. And the end result is what you see now. What you see now is not a result of the Navy bombing the place. They made it worse. But the lack of almost any vegetation on the island is a result of the sheep and especially the goats. This island has an estimated 15 to 20,000 goats on it. The Navy, since the 1960s, has actually brought in Marine sniper units to try to take out the goats. And the end result is usually they shoot about 10 goats, and I suspect, given how fast goats breed, probably in a week later, they got 20 goats per place, the 10 they lost. So it's an absolute nightmare. No one knows what to do. It's a classic example of you commercialize an island by bringing in animals so you can make money off of them. But in this particular situation, as frequently happens, all of a sudden people decided that they didn't want goats. If you think about it, if you go into some other times and stuff like that, you're not going to find goat meat in the meat counter. The only thing we use it for in Maui is occasionally some of the guys jerk it, and the Filipino families in Upper Kula will go and buy a goat from you, but they're not going to pay more than $1 for it. So why would you bother to shoot a goat and gut it and clean it just to get $1 for it? It's going to cost you more than that. Just the bullet alone is going to cost you 30 cents. So the end result is you just, these animals have no value. They're a total waste of time. They're about as useful as a pigeon in Kapi'olani Park. But then the devastation they've caused in this massive area, notice how you've lost all the vegetation. There's absolutely nothing in this whole, this is all dirt and rocks and a few low brush. And all the rest of this island is completely gone. The topsoil is completely gone for most of the island. All you've got is rock, because that's all that's left when the goats are done. So what you have is a pasturage system. But the reality is this is what you end up with. You used to have trees and clumps of grass and sweet potatoes and stuff like that. And this is what you've got in 2020. That's not what's a view of Lanai from Kaho'olawe. You've got this area here, and that's because of the goats. So this is what happens when you go to a pasturage system, but it's also more importantly part of this whole idea of commercial agriculture. For the folks that put up a plantation here in the 1880s, a ranch in the 1880s, they probably knew by then, since people knew that bringing the goats over here wasn't a really great idea, because they knew that the goats would probably hammer the island. But on the other hand, they wanted to make some money. The land was there, so they threw the goats in the island and went over there, occasionally caught them and made some money off of it. We're probably okay with it. Now in 2020, you've got one of the major Hawaiian islands that's totally depopulated and no one knows what to do with it. It's completely wiped. No one has any clue what you could eventually do with this island to make it useful. And that's one reason why in 1941, the Navy takes it over for bombing. Because look at the bright side from their standpoint. There's no one you can kill. No one lives there. And there was a ranch, so there's not a lot you're going to be able to blow up. And all you're going to do is kill goats, and there's absolutely no one in the Hawaiian Islands that's going to shed a tear about a dead goat. So that becomes one of our major islands, becomes what's left of Kaho'olawe. But it's also a classic example of this whole process of making the type of decisions that people make when they change the form of agriculture and the way that they do see the world around them, and especially when they change from the idea of subsistence to the idea of doing stuff that generates revenue or generates money. So when you think about that, probably one of the easiest mantras would be Kaho'olawe. And that is what it is in large part because of people making that choice in the last 100, 120 years. But you can also see one of the side effects of this is also the whole issue of ranching. If you look at Northern Africa, you see a very similar phenomenon. In a rather sad way, it looks almost exactly the same, where people keep on making choices about raising goats and sheep in an area which really can't handle goats and sheep. And the end result is they're actually destroying their environment every day that they have the goats and the sheep there. But now they're in the situation they want the money from the goats and the sheep. So it's sort of like, well, I'll run the sheep for 10 more years and then I'm going to quit. And of course, the problem is then there's no longer anything you can do with the land. So it's completely gone. Let's take a look at one of the last examples of this since I've got this up. Swinging back to Google Maps here and see if it shows up. No, it's sort of I'm not sure if I'd call it global, but certainly in the larger scale of when you look at it, sort of trying to figure out just exactly why people thought they were making decisions that they made. Okay, let's wait for this to show up. Let me switch back here. This is area in Southern California. We're north of LA. Now, there's several things that are really interesting when you look about this. And this is California is one of the quintessential examples of a modern 21st century use of the land. What's really weird about this landscape? It's really striking when you fly over it. Don't look too hard. This is a Thursday afternoon question, which means if it takes you more than 20 seconds, you're working too hard.
All the properties are very like similar to each other.
Notice how everything's done. It looks like a bad geometry class. Everything's in rectangles and squares. Look at this square with 2, 4, 6, 8 rectangles in it. 2, 4, 6, 8 rectangles in it. 2, 4, 6, 8 rectangles in it. Now, I hate to tell you guys this, but Mother Nature don't do rectangles and squares. Okay? This has nothing to do with nature. This is entirely man-made. So what you've got here is the human modification of the landscape. And trust me, if you're one of the Indians who used to live here, you'd be absolutely freaking out if you saw this picture, because it has absolutely nothing to do with the way this land looked even into the early 20th century. This area was largely dry. It didn't have a lot of plants. It was pretty much, not barren, but it wasn't quite Mojave Desert, but there wasn't a lot going on there. And all of a sudden in the early 20th century, they start move, especially river water from the Colorado River. They ship it over 800 miles to the west to Southern California. And all of a sudden now you have water available. So what happens is people start to irrigate and they start to farm. And that's what you got here. Now, if you notice what you actually see here is a classic process. You farm this pot and you're going to do this part next year, and this classic sort of cycle of farming. But the problem you've got here is the way the soil operates and everything else. Notice how we just go from one to the other. But the problem that you have in this whole area is that this area is actually very near desert. So among other things, and what you use in this whole area are these huge sprinkler systems. They're like what you'd see on a lawn, but they're absolutely enormous things. So you have like 3 or 4 sprinklers will basically pump water out over this entire thing. Now, the average temperature right now, if this is around Modesto, and I used to have to install air conditioning down here way before you guys were born. I can guarantee if this is about 1:30 in the afternoon and it's late September in Modesto, this is probably about 103 degrees out right now. Okay. So this is just pumping heat, especially now with the fires going on. It's probably more like 107. Now, if you know anything about sprinklers, so we'll say that someone's spraying a bunch of water onto this. What's actually going to happen to most of that water that's sprayed out of that sprinkler within maybe 5 or 10 minutes? I'll give you a hint. It won't get on the plants. Where will it end up? "30-mile-an-hour winds, 107-degree temperature, hot as snot. A few degrees more, you can actually cook eggs in this thing. What's going to happen when the water's sprayed into the air?
Wouldn't like evaporate?
Yeah, poop, it's gone. These guys usually figure if 5% of the water ends up on the plants, they're doing well. So 95% of the water they're taking out of the Colorado River disappears into the atmosphere. It's not even getting down here. So all that distance, all that water went that's not going to somewhere else or to Mexico or someplace in the river is now not actually on the plants. It's just vanished because it's cheaper to use a sprinkler than to use some like drip feed irrigation or something that's more environmentally responsible. They don't care because they're in the business of making money. Okay. Now what happens also is because so much of that water evaporates and you're using these fields a lot more than you should, is you end up with this. Now this used to be an actual field probably 5 or 10 or 15 years ago. Here you can see a slightly older one. What happens is if you spray the waters on these areas, since they don't have any drainage system, the water basically sits there. So it's like where I used to live in Baratania. So when it rains, it just ends up with a big puddle wall. Eventually it evaporates, you end up with stuff. When water evaporates, or if you, for example, if you got a house plant, you pour too much water on it, eventually the thing dies. What you'll see on the surface of the dirt will be little crystals. Those are salt crystals. That's what happens here. If someone's growing these crops like these guys here, they can literally look out the door of their house, say their house is over here, and they're looking down here. What they're going to see is fields that belong, maybe they're old fields, but they belong to someone. But if you look at them now in the morning, they actually sparkle because there's salt there. Nothing grows here. That's nothing but salt. And it's not edible salt. It's salts like toxic salts. So when the wind blows, and I know because I've been stuck in this, that ends up in your eyes and you can get blinded. Okay. Now that was a field just like this one till maybe 10 or 15 years ago because it's still got the ridge marks in it, so it's pretty recent. Now what that person did is they planted, and people have known this since the 1920s. People kept on planting this piece of real estate, knowing that within the next year, the next 10 years, next 20 years, it was going to salt out. That's the term you use, and you were going to lose it. He's lost one here. Whoever owns this property has salted this piece out. This piece is salted out. They're still planting the rest of them. And I can guarantee, given the way this one looks, that's going to be gone in 5 years. In Southern California, they've lost almost 30% of their agricultural land due to this practice. They're literally killing the land so they can make money on it right now. That's a classic example of commercial agriculture. Okay. You don't care that your kids are not going to have any property unless they'd like to see sparkles in the morning. They're not going to have any property that is at all utility. You can't grow anything here. You can't even use this land. It's dangerous. It's a lot more dangerous than a desert, and nothing will grow here at all. Nothing grows here because it's toxic. It's the equivalent of sort of like a waste dump and salts. And it's estimated it's going to take between 400 and 600 years for this to return to land that you can actually grow plants on. So you've not only killed it for a little while, you've killed it for, for all intents and purposes for the rest of, recent human history. It's gone. And if you look here, you start to look at these blank spots, and it is really scary. This was all ag land. You can see it's still actually got the grids in it. And it ain't there no more. That's the decisions that people make with commercial agriculture. Some of the farmers here, ironically, now want the public, i.e. you guys, to pay tax money to buy this land that they've destroyed so they're not stuck with land that's not usable. Never mind the fact they did that very intentionally when it happened, but they now want to get bailed out for it. Okay. This is a really good example of what happens when this process takes place. You end up with absolutely devastated pieces of property. In fact, I bet we can probably go down here and take a look. Let's see. Let's see what they've done on this side. They can't do anything with it. And that's not even regular desert. Desert in this part of California actually has a lot more trees and stuff. This is basically totally nuked. Notice how it's actually not any healthier than the mid thing of the freeway. This place here, they're actually using trees now and they're cheating. Each of these trees, they've dug holes in the ground. They put basically compost in there. So the trees aren't actually growing in this land. The trees are actually growing in little pockets of soil. But within 5 or 10 years, these trees will be dead too, because these salts will basically seep into this area and the trees will just die. So they're going to have trees here for about 5 years till maybe about this tall, and then this field will have to be abandoned. It'll never be usable for anything for another 500 years. That's the decision-making process that perfectly logical people are making in 2020 about what they should use the land for. Because the idea of the commodification or the relative cash value of things is the only part of the discussion that they pay attention to. They're not interested in any other part of the discussion, like as well, what's, you're thinking about a kid who's 5 or 10 years old who's growing up in this area. By the time they're finished, by the time they're at your age, there's not going to be anything left here. It's all going to look like that. their entire world will be dead because their parents and their grandparents made it dead, not because Mother Nature did it. This has nothing to do with Mother Nature. They talk about a drought in California. This is not a drought because all this water was brought in through irrigation. The water isn't even from there. So when you're looking at these type of decisions and choices that people make, this is one of the really critical aspects of it, is a lot of societies like to think of themselves as, fairly rational or whatever you want to call it, really make incredibly stupid decisions on a very regular basis. And because everyone's making money out of the whole thing, or enough people are making money out of it, no one wants to say, wait, time out, we got to change this. Because no one knows what they would do as an alternative. And right now, especially in American society, all alternatives have to be money-based alternatives. So if you suddenly tell someone, okay, you've got this ranch over in a side over here, and we're going to tell you to stop ranching, we're going to tell you to start growing crops there, raising goats there because you're going to destroy the landscape, then they're going to say, well, fine, but I need to make a living. What are you going to do for me instead? And this is oftentimes the problem you get when you have these environmental discussions like are going on right now, that the United States has to be more environmentally responsible. We have to do da-da-da-da-da. That's all good and fine, but we're a cash-based society. We're a consumer-based society. And at some point you have to address that. Otherwise, you're never going to get what you theoretically want out of it, which is to have, property that's sustainable for the future. Now, this becomes even more complicated when you realize that a lot of these discussions are occurring within the context of what's been called the green revolutions, which the book goes into in a pretty good detail. The key thing to remember with these, there's actually a whole series of these green revolutions, but they all have sort of the same scenario behind them. Let's segue back because this map's more fun to watch. So if we visualize this area, and we'll say we're now, oh, I remember Delano, I've been there before. So if you're in this area here, and in fact, all these roads are. So all this is commercial cropping. I have no idea I'm not that good at trees. I have no idea what those trees are. So this is all commercial cropping. Now, until the 1920s, 1930s, commercial cropping consisted largely of different types of trees or plants that you found in a particular region. You might take them to somewhere else on the planet, but they're pretty much the same thing. They pretty much gave the same type of yields. In other words, each of these trees would give you, we'll say these are, I don't know, walnut trees or something like that. So each of these trees like this one would give you X amount of nuts per tree. And the problem you got into was the amount of area that you had planted. On one hand, it was pretty handy because you could actually predict how much food you were going to get off of this spot because you knew exactly how many nuts you get per tree. And that had been the same for, maybe 500, 1,000 years or something like that. And so what you get into is in this context, the population, the human population of the planet, remember our Malthus and his equation again, because of food availability and other resources, is the population was increasing more quickly than the amount of food that we were generating. So you end up in sort of that situation where you've got more bodies than you do food. And this was becoming an enormous issue by basically right around before World War II, but especially after World War II, say 1950. There were huge numbers of studies done by the then brand new United Nations that the entire planet was going to be basically in starvation by 1965 or 1970. That basically a quarter of the world's population was going to be starving to death. And so what they started is this huge global thing, which was basically trying to figure out how to modify, if you couldn't change the amount of land you had in food, then your only other alternative if you want to increase how much food you've got is to change the type of plants you've got. And these are what we call the green revolutions. Now the first of these actually would go back thousands of years. That would be like that Tecate turning into maize thing as I showed you. That would be where basically you change some plant, you turn to a modified version so it gives you more food than the original version. Classic Mendelian genetics. And that's how things were done into the 1950s. In the 1950s, they started to come up with very complex systems of doing more quick or more advanced high-speed genetic modification. And that was intentionally because they literally saw the clock on the wall. They literally were thinking, if we say 1950, if we don't get this sorted by 1960, large numbers of the world's population are going to be starving by 1965. So they basically saw themselves as a very small window that they had to somehow figure out how to make a lot more food per acre or per whatever this is in an incredibly short period of time. Basically, the time if you guys are now graduating from Chaminade, between now and the time you're 30 years of age. You know, we're not talking, I know it seems like a long time for you guys maybe, but it's not very long. And so what they did is they basically came up, this became a massive effort and a bunch of companies became involved. And this was what they call the Green Revolution. They actually figured out all sorts of different ways to modify the amount of food a plant would give you. The most famous of these would probably be rice, which you guys probably eat a lot of if you're like me. And it's, you know, it's about this tall, it grows in wet fields, and you get, you know, X amount of food out of it. By, I think, 1956, 1957, they started heavily modifying rice. So that same plant now gives you 6 times more food per plant. The rice that you harvest now gives you about 15 times more food than the same rice in 1950. So in that, if this was a rice field, you're now getting 15 times more food from that same piece of real estate, which means now that you're basically feeding what would have been 15 of these areas to feed the same number of people. You're doing it with 1. So this was the first of the real spectacular green revolutions, because it occurred in a bunch of the basic food crops: corn, wheat, rice, soybeans. All these things got these genetically modified versions. Now, they weren't GMO modified like we think of in 2020, but they were modified in the sense you did very fast-paced, you know, Mendelian type genetic modification to come up with new hybridized species. And what that did is that also meant that 1965 didn't happen. By the late 1950s, there'd been this green revolution had been so revolutionary that the world's population basically got themselves in an area surplus. So rather than people running short of food, there was actually more food than people needed. And one of the side effects, ironically, would be McDonald's hamburgers. What would McDonald's hamburgers have to do with food surpluses for people? What do you feed things that go moo and generate hamburgers? Or I should say become hamburgers. What do they eat?
Grass. Or
Okay, well, yeah, back in the day, that would be free-range cattle would eat grass. But outside of Hawaii, I don't think there are any free-range cattle, except maybe in Montana. What do 99% of the cattle that you guys eat as steaks or hamburger, what are they actually eating most of the time? Anyone know? I'll give you a hint. Most of them probably have never seen grass in their entire lives. Of course, most of them haven't actually walked more than about 60 feet in their entire lives. They spent their entire life in a very small cage.
Something artificial.
No, it's well, yeah, you're 40% right and 60% not quite right.
isn't it like, I saw a documentary of it. It's like corn or like some sort of like food, or like they do like antibiotics and stuff. They feed them like all that nasty stuff to make them fat.
Okay,
Like,
yeah, both of you are right. Yeah, I think someone else said something. Yeah, it's what they're eating is soybean and corn and other plants that you guys would eat. So what happened was by the early 1960s, because you now had a food surplus, is the farmers that were growing this stuff were sort of like, now they had this new crop that we're going to not grow it. So what they started to do is look around and try to figure out, well, what else could you use this spare food for? You can't keep it forever. You have to use it within maybe 6 months or something, especially soybeans. So what they did is they start looking around and realizing that if you started to use it to fatten cattle, to feed chickens, to feed pigs, you now ended up with a massive increase in the amount of meat that you had available. And so what happens is all of a sudden meat becomes incredibly cheap. And then you can have places like fast food places where you can have a hamburger for $1 or $2 with meat in it, whereas before you could have never afforded that, because then, if you think about it, if you're chasing cows around and they're eating grass, 1, that's not a lot of cows per acre, and 2, you got to chase the bugger down, then you got to go catch it, haul its ass somewhere, and then turn it into a hamburger. If you have it in a large facility like maybe here, and you've literally got a couple of thousand cows stuck in little tiny pens, you just take the food to them, you feed them, and when you need them, you just hit them with a cattle prod through the brain, kill them right there on the spot, and you fed them, like you said, you can feed them the antibiotics, whatever else you want to make them fat more quickly. You actually then modify the cows so that the cows actually grow more quickly and they grow fatter more quickly. One of the sad things, if you actually look at what we call pen cattle, in the sense of cattle raised in buildings, if you actually take them outside, in many cases, they really can't walk. They're cows, but they're not functional cattle. They're now basically hamburger and steaks with legs attached. And that's what we eat. And that's a side result of the Green Revolution. With the surplus in grain resources, you then convert that to feeding other animals, and then you now have a surplus or a larger amount of meat resources. So the amount of meat that Americans consume started to skyrocket, and the amount of meat that people consume globally started to skyrocket. Because now you had cheap meat because you had cheap grains. So the grain revolution didn't end up with a surplus. You just found other places to spend the grain. And the end result is by the 1970s, they ended up short of food again. The amount of grain was shrinking because you got so many things that you wanted to use it for. And people had gotten so spoiled being able to go to McDonald's or Zippy's or someplace like that and get a hamburger or any other type of meat really easily, that became normal. And so what happened is the surplus became part of a new world. And all of a sudden it wasn't a surplus anymore. It was like if Xavier or someone gets a pay raise, after a couple of months, they don't see it as a pay raise, it's just part of your paycheck. So that's what happened with all this. By the 1980s, early 1990s, you had a new problem, which was the same problem all over again. You were starting to run short of food. You now had all these other demands. You now needed grains not only for people, but you needed them for feed animals, all the rest of the stuff, because no one wanted to give up any of the new toys they had. And you had to figure out how to do it. And so what you did is you came up with the modern form of this, what is oftentimes called GMO. Because you no longer had the time or luxury, one, to depend on modifying a plant here till it fits what you want. Now you wanted to do a lot of stuff with it. And when you started to get you are actually starting to look at genetic records. You could actually look at the genotype record of a species. You can actually then take parts of that genotype and you can actually pull it out of one thing. You can put it in another organism. So for example, if it's like, say, potatoes. Potatoes are really prone to several animals or bugs and stuff that eat potatoes. So you find some other plant that has some sort of toxin in it that those animals don't like, those insects can't stand, or maybe it kills them. And you put that part of that genotype in the potato genotype. So what happens is when the potato grows, now it has the same toxicity to that insect that the original weed did or whatever it was. Now, if you're a farmer, that means that now you don't have to use insecticides because the plant is its own insecticide. You can also modify the plant. You find some other variety of a plant that's sort of similar, that's a lot easier, doesn't need as much water. And then so what you do is you plug that part of the code, the genetic code, into the potato that you're trying to grow. So now your potatoes grow the same, but they don't need as much water to get to the same size. And now they're protected. They've got now built-in insecticides in them. And so now you start to modify these things genetically incredibly quickly. We're one of the world's centers for this. Monsanto uses roughly 40% of their genetics researches here in Hawaii because of the climate here. It makes it perfect for fast forwarding these things. This is what happens when you go up to Wahiawa. You go walk around some of the agricultural fields there and you're going to find security guys around your ass in about 10 seconds. Especially true if I go back home in Maui. Almost all of the Kihei section of Maui is entirely in Monsanto owned land, which is very heavily secured because that's where they're doing all their genetic modifications, especially for corn and such like that they then sell globally. So two things happen out of this. One that's sort of weird, we'll get into this a little bit more later, is that because the scientists at Monsanto or whoever are doing these genetic modifications, in the same way that Kara can come up with a new idea or write a book and she has the copyright on that, and the same way then that Monsanto has the copyright on this new form of potato because they made it. They put the insecticide into it, they put the more drought resistance into it, maybe they changed the color of it, I don't know what the hell they did to it, but they changed all this stuff and they did it in their labs. So it's their potato. So they now own that potato, which means if anyone else wants to buy that potato, they have to pay Monsanto for the rights for it. It's not just a potato you pick up at Lowe's or Home Depot or some other garden shop. It's now a commodity, just like watching a Netflix video. You have to pay for it because they own it. Since the 1980s and now in 2020, roughly 70% of the food crops that are consumed on planet Earth are owned by 3 private companies. In 1980, there weren't any food crops that were owned by private companies. It's one of the enormous changes globally. It's the vast majority of food that people consume on planet Earth is actually privately owned. The genetic code for that, or if you want to, the seeds or whatever, are actually owned by companies, for-profit companies, by the way. So you've actually commercialized agriculture in a way that was never even thought of even 40 or 50 years ago. That has huge implications. Because if those guys want more profit, they can just make you pay more to get that plant, which means that you might not have any food. But of course, they've got a great situation because you need food to survive, so you're going to pay anything for that plant because you don't have any choice. The second part of that, or actually the ancillary part of that, was, we'll say this guy over here has this new potato. And this guy over here, this guy over here is growing the same potato. Or not, he's growing potatoes, but not growing, he hasn't paid Monsanto. It's not Monsanto's potato. Now, the problem he's going to get into, and actually was in that picture, is that you're going to find that potatoes, like many crops, have little flowers on them. They're pretty little sort of blue-white flowers. And what happens is, as bees come down, bees do a little dance, take the nectar out of the flower. I'm sure you remember this from grade school or high school. And they go and they pollinate the flower. And they take those pistules, they take the pollen parts on them, and they go and fly to other plants and they pollinate the other plants. Now, when Monsanto changes that modification to their potato, among other things, they actually put a piece of code by virtue of a very specific piece of DNA that they put into that potato, which doesn't do anything, but proves that it's Monsanto's potato. So it's like having a copyright notice in a book, or has some sort of a code that you have on a video or that you watched on Netflix that basically says this belongs to Netflix. So we'll say that some bees are over here doing their thing and they're going and, visiting this guy's Monsanto potatoes. They now go over here and those bees are visiting his potatoes. What's going to happen to those potatoes? What's going to happen to that farmer? What's he going to find when those potatoes reseed themselves the next year when the potatoes grow? It's sort of bizarre, but see if you guys can figure this out. So here we got Monsanto potatoes. These guys aren't Monsanto potatoes, but the bees are going da-da-da. I don't know what bee noise are. Bzzz, they're doing the thing over here. They're going bzzz, and they're doing the thing over here. What have they brought from here to here?
The code.
The code, the genetic code. So what he's going to find is next year his potatoes don't look quite the same. They look like the potatoes over here. Now, he didn't do anything. He was just an innocent bystander. The bees are just cruising around. Bees have no concept of territory. They give a rat's ass. They're just down here because, whatever, it's Thursday, why not? And they don't know what they're particularly doing. And bees don't pollinate because it's like part of their job description. It's just part of life as a bee. So all of a sudden now, what's going to happen is Monsanto will go around and take samples from everyone's fields, and they're going to find that his fields down here have their code. What are they going to do? And I'll give you a hint. They'll give him two choices. What's choice number one? Because Payton's exactly right. They can actually, when they pull one of the leaves off of this and they sample it, they're going to find the genetic code with that little piece of DNA that says Monsanto on it. Now, he can prove that he didn't steal it from him, we'll say. But what are they still going to tell him? He's going to have two choices. And they want a bunch of, go ahead. Yeah, tear the field up, destroy his crop, and go and buy the potatoes from somewhere else so they're not Monsanto's. What's choice number two, which is actually what they want him to do?
Give the potatoes to them.
Well, or actually pay them the fee just like he bought the potatoes from them. Because they're their potatoes. They can prove it. They have won a ton of court cases. Now in US law, they actually own it. Even if you're 150, 200 miles away, it's been a big issue with corn in places like Iowa. Birds can move the pollen around, and you can be somewhere you aren't even anywhere near anyone that grew that stuff. It shows up and it's Monsanto's, or I can't remember what the other two companies are. And basically now they tell you, you either plow that field up and you make no money this year, or you pay us the same amount you would have if you had bought it from us to put it in that field. So even if you're not one of their farmers, even if you're not buying their crop, you actually you're stuck with their crop. And that's one of the really scary aspects. That came here a big issue with Dalo about 10 years ago when UH got involved in doing Dalo GMO for the purpose of making money. They were going to sell the rights to it. And then all the farmers freaked out because they said, well, we can't control where the bees go. And we're not going to pay you guys money for something that we didn't actually want. Especially because if you think about it, given the current reaction in Europe and a lot of the United States, why is this farmer going to be really pissed off if he's trying to sell these potatoes to like Whole Foods? What just happened when those bees came down here and messed with his potatoes? What can't he tell Whole Foods any for?
It's no longer his potatoes.
They're now GMO potatoes. And if you go into Whole Foods or any place like that, they love to say non-GMO. So his market that he had to a particular, market or whatever, he's now reamed. Now he has to compete with everyone else that's just growing potatoes to sell at Walmart or something like that, where they don't give a rat's ass whether it's GMO or not. So what you find is if this is a huge issue in the United States, there's been a lot of lawsuits and they've all lost, where farmers actually say, I've got this property here and I don't want GMO because that's not what I can market. I have to market to non-GMO, I have to market that I have non-GMO plants. But if you think about it, how the hell are you going to keep the bees and everything out of your property so that you can guarantee what you got? If your neighbors are growing, or even just one neighbor, maybe this guy up here is the only guy growing GMO plants, but everyone's going to have GMO plants. And if you want to have non-GMO plants, the only thing you do, I don't know what the hell you do. Cover it in plastic. So the weird situation is because they control the rights to the plant, they can, when anyone gets it, whether you wanted to have it or not, they own you too. And the other part is if you have a part, if all of a sudden all the farmers over here declare we don't want GMO on our plants because the folks we sell to won't buy GMO produce. And then all of a sudden they're saying, well, they're telling everyone over here, how you guys are telling the government, how are you going to protect us from the GMO farmers? Because of course, if Peyton or someone else is a farmer over here, he has the right, he has the right to grow what he wants to on his property. No one can at gunpoint tell him he's got to grow a GMO plant. But Mother Nature and the bees are going to give him GMO plants whether he wants them or not, unless you literally strip him out of the whole damn valley of Central California. And of course, then Monsanto is going to sue you. And other farmers are going to sue you because maybe they want to grow GMO plants because it uses less water, it has insecticides, and all that stuff goes on. This is one of the enormous problems is when you look at this whole issue of GMO. This is the second green revolution. Things like corn are really scary. But there's actually a third, and if any of you are in meds or going into medical practices, what's actually the third part, going back to my thing that I mentioned about the potato, for example, having insecticides now built into it. What's the scary part that you don't have to do if you do GMO studies, or if you're Monsanto? What don't you have to study? Which is why in Europe, I should point out, a lot of GMOs are illegal. You can't GMO potatoes in Europe and you can't GMO corn in Europe. If they find you bringing it in, they'll actually destroy the crop for you. They don't want GMO corn and potatoes. And one of the reasons both of those have a lot of insecticides in them. What are they worried about? I'll give you a hint. The GMO in corn, the insecticides went in, I'll just make a number arbitrarily. We'll say the insecticides went into corn in 2006. So from 2006 on, we'll say about 2008, most corn in the United States has the GMO, is a GMO modified version. It has insecticides built in to keep insects out of the corn. Now they also have other things which, for example, makes the corn last longer. You see this a lot with apples and tomatoes. Apples and tomatoes now, if they're in a store, will last longer than they did 5 years ago, because now they've got actually anti-rot built into the skins. Why are the Europeans so upset about all that? Why won't, if Kayla's in some, I know I'm picking on her. If Kara's somewhere in Europe and why can't she buy these new types of apples? Why won't the Europeans sell them? Why do the health ministries not want to see those apples in Europe? I mean, the apple will last for 6 weeks. It used to last for 1 week.
Maybe the chemicals, they think it's dangerous for consumption over a long period of time.
Really close, except for the word chemicals. Notice how you have to change it, because you're not actually spraying chemicals on the plants. It's now part of the genetic code in the plant. Now, the advantage of chemicals would be, if you're spraying chemicals, for example, diathlon, which is one of the ones that Monsanto still likes to try to use here, which is actually highly toxic. The great advantage of a chemical is Monsanto or someone else can actually just take that to a lab and they can test it. And in a very short time, you can tell this sucker is bad news. It's going to give kids, mental issues, blah, 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 whatever it might be. What's the scary thing if you're talking about a GMO modified skin of an apple? because it's not chemical. It's now inherent in the cellular structure of the apple. But what don't you know? And remember, it only happened in 2008, so it's now 2020, so that's what, 12 years ago. So we'll say that, I haven't been picked on yet. We'll say that Monsi loves apples. And so she's now been eating, sorry, now I'm talking about this is all hypothetical, don't panic. So she's now been eating these apples. She eats 1 or 2 a day, okay? And it's now 2020, and she's eaten these since she was like 4. So God knows how many apples she's consumed, okay? What doesn't anyone know about the apples she's consumed in terms of what it did to her? I'll give you, it's the same issue they're worried about with the COVID vaccine.
There may be stuff going into her body that that doesn't really have like noticeable effects.
Yeah, it's a classic example called cumulative effects, long-term effects. With genetically modified plants especially, and also genetically modified animals, especially chickens, because the argument was made at the time that you needed to have these animals and plants modified so there'd be enough food for people not to starve, they were able to basically get waivers on what we call long-term impacts. So for example, anything that Monsanto grows in Hawaii can then be marketed usually within a year globally. Now we know, for example, that the corn that's grown globally, the GMO corn, has a lot of insecticides in it, which is really great because it means you don't have to spray chemicals on the corn. But what we don't know is because those insecticide issues are built into the DNA of the corn, so they're actually in the corn you consume in the pieces of corn. We don't know how much, for example, that builds up in your body. We don't know what other type of impacts that has on other organs or other parts of the organism or something else. There's some evidence from the Europeans that ironically what it does have an impact is on bacteria. So there's some evidence that at least internal bacteria that you have, and you remember you have tons of different types, millions of different types of bacteria in your body. But one of it appears, at least the European studies are starting to suggest that long-term consumption of insecticide-based GMO products tends to reduce the variety of bacteria in the body. Now, on one hand, that might actually be good. You're getting whatever ones like E. coli or something like that could actually eventually be bad for you. But you might also be getting rid of other bacteria that are actually part of this sort of systemic complex that makes your body work. But you're not, like Peyton pointed out, you're not going to know because most of these products have only existed for less than 15 years. Most of them only been consumed for 10 years. So you don't know what the 25-year or 50-year impact is because you're not going to know till 2025 or 2035, or in Monsi's case, maybe when 2040, when all of a sudden something starts to show up and they're going like, hey, yeah, you get a lot of apples, yeah? And so what you find is this is why in places like Europe, they've been very limiting in terms of GMO. It's not that GMO is bad for you. It's just that you don't have the long-term studies to show that it's not going to have an impact on you. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, this is that whole issue with vaccines. There's at least 3 vaccines that work already for COVID. But the problem is, at least the famous British one, is one of the folks in a small sample that got it ended up with spinal problems within a day. Now, if you suddenly inject 20 million people with that thing, you better be real sure that you're not going to have a side effect, either immediate or maybe 2 or 5 years down the road from something that you thought was a good idea. Way back before you guys were born, when I was significantly younger, it seems to me there's some sort of drug they were giving pregnant women. I can't remember why. Or they were giving people, and pregnant women suddenly found they were getting an enormous increase in abortions and kids with all sorts of weird birth defects. And it turned out there was something that they were being given, I can't remember what the injection was for, that was actually, no one had done a long-term study to find out whether that was going to be, whether there were some side effects. And when it did, there was a massive lawsuit, and one of the drug companies went bankrupt as a result of it. And even more unfortunately, a bunch of people ended up with kids who had tremendous issues. So one of the problems is because our ability to change things has grown so rapidly, our abilities to test those things hasn't grown equally rapidly. So you can come up with a brand new vaccine in a couple of months, but you're not going to know what the 5-year, 10-year, 25-year impacts are until 5, 10, 25 years has gone by. The GMO crops are very much in the same system. And this is why you find some places in the world, even the Chinese are getting very leery of GMO. In Japan, it's very hard to buy GMO products. Japanese won't have anything to do with GMO, nor will Koreans. And the reason is very simply, they're not comfortable with the level of analysis in terms of the long-term impacts of GMO products. They're very comfortable with chemicals because they know exactly from long-term what the impacts of chemicals. We have a lot of work done on things like lead, almost all of the insecticides, very explicitly, what are the, 5, 10-year, 25-year impacts of these things? GMO products, we don't. But the argument that the companies that make the products is you need them to feed the world's population, which is true. So if you suddenly say no to them, you'll go back to the issues you had in 1950 where you're looking at starvation or 10 or 15 years down the road. So GMO is one of those classic examples. On one hand, it seems like a totally good thing, which on one hand it is. You're very quickly modifying animals and plants so they can generate more per acre, less water usage, less environmental impact in terms of pesticides, whatever. So on one hand, it's a fantastic thing. On the other hand, you also have the counter argument, which is that you don't really know what you're putting into yourself from a GMO modified plant or animal, because you're not really too sure what the implications are. And going back to something Kayla mentioned earlier, when you do like antibiotics and stuff in animals, that's actually the one advantage is we have a pretty good idea of what antibiotics do because you have those long-term studies. But if you've actually put something in the cells of the chicken, so you don't need the antibiotic, then that's a whole new world out there, and that we don't know. So on one hand, you end up with a lot fatter chickens that grow a lot more quickly, you use less food and whatever. But on the other hand, what does that mean if you're feeding your kids a bunch of KFC chicken? And right now we don't know. So when you're looking at this whole issue of GMO and genetic modification and commercialization, they're all tied together in someone's pretty sort of surreal way when you think about it in terms of how this stuff is linked in ways, but oftentimes don't get discussed that way. A lot of the anti-GMO guys make all sorts of weird things about GMO poisoning you, which is not true. We don't have evidence that GMO does anything, but it hasn't been around long enough to be able to say conclusively it doesn't do anything. That's one of the huge complexities of it. Here in Hawaii, it's become a huge issue. If you're familiar with what the issues on Kauai in the last 5 years. On Kauai, they decided that GMO, especially the spraying and the GMO products themselves, were actually making people sick because a lot of it was near schools. And there was enormous pressure. They spent, huge amount of effort trying to get it off the island. And Monsanto specifically was very aggressive and counter to suing them and saying basically you had no proof that it was a bad thing. Therefore, you have to allow it because we're in the business of making money, so it's commercial agriculture. And finally, this last year, the county was able to get them to leave. They finally won a huge series of lawsuits, I think all the way up to the US Supreme Court, where they said that the lack of data about this meant that you were putting people at risk unnecessarily. And Monsanto's argument is that's totally false. And that's still what they argue on Maui, which still does GMO. And we still have it here in Oahu. If you live in Mililani, you're exposed to it every day. So GMO is a huge issue here because it's become our new form of commercial agriculture. We don't grow food to eat. We grow the modified seed products that are sold in a lot of the rest of the planet. So at the same time, you can drive down through Wahiawan, you can see acres and acres of corn. You can't eat any of that. A couple of acres of that corn would pay for your entire college education because that's how much money Monsanto is going to charge for it. Okay. So I don't want anyone to get any sneaky ideas of going out at 2 in the morning with a sock over their head and harvesting some Monsanto corn and throwing it in the back of their car and coming back and trying to flog it at Chaminade for your education. Okay. So, okay, does that all sort of make sense? Oh, okay. So if we're all good on that, then I guess we're all set. And I'll see you guys